So thanks, Dan Egan, for being with us. And you've been writing about the Great Lakes for many years. Your most recent book we're talking about today, The Death and Life of the Great Lakes, has been chosen to be the April pick for the PBS NewsHour New York Times Book Club, called Now Read This, which means people are now reading your book all across the nation and probably across the world now in a new way, and making a lot of people aware of you and your work. So we want to congratulate you on that, and we want to thank you so much for being with us. And let's start off with some background on you, just a little bit about where you were born. Were you born on the Great Lakes?
Yeah, I was born in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and I grew up there, and spent a lot of my summers on the Great Lakes, on the Door Peninsula specifically. Both sets of grandparents had homes up there, so a lot of my vacations and weekends were spent on the waters of Lake Michigan. And then after college, I moved out to Yellowstone National Park, actually, and worked there for about a year with the park historian, and then I got my first newspaper job in Sun Valley, Idaho. And this was in the early 90s, and it just so happened that environmental issues were really a big deal. They still are, but at that particular time, salmon restoration, wolf restoration, grizzly bear restoration were all real hot button issues that I was covering. And I was out west for the better part of a decade, and then I moved back to my home state of Wisconsin, and I took a job at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, not as an environment writer, but as a feature writer. We called it a super GA job, so just kind of long-term feature projects. And there is no better way, I found, to appreciate a Great Lake than to spend like a decade in the desert. You come back and look at it with a fresh set of eyes. So I really found myself drawn to the lake that first year on the job, and doing stories about who made their living on the lake, ecological issues facing the lake. And then I started doing bigger stories about the Great Lakes in general, and then pretty quickly it evolved into a beat. So that's how I got started on this.
And you eventually were a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for the journalism that you did writing about the Great Lakes. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, that's correct, in 2010 and 2013.
What prompted you to go ahead and write this book specifically about the death and life of the Great Lakes? How'd that happen?
Well, it had been suggested by a number of people, including my editor, the editor of the newspaper, that I write a book, because I'd been doing these long stories for numerous years, and they were kind of stacking up like chapters. But I didn't want to write a book because I've got a full-time job, I've got a family and 4 kids all still at home in school. That's a full-time job. I didn't have room for another job, and so I didn't want to do it. But in 2012, I took my family out to New York for a fellowship/master's program at Columbia University, and part of that program involved a book writing seminar, and that's where I put together this book proposal, based entirely on work that I had already done for the newspaper. And I was a little taken aback by how interesting people thought it was, because these people weren't from the Great Lakes. And once again, I think I had been here in Wisconsin, here in the Great Lakes, long enough where I was taking a lot of these issues for granted and didn't really recognize the value of the story of the Great Lakes. And so that's what got the ball rolling. And I ended up took an academic year off to go to Columbia, and then I was at the paper for a year, and then I took 20 months off to write the book.
It is amazing, the interest right now in the Great Lakes, and there's so much happening. I mean, as we speak, there are issues involving the Line 5 pipeline that are breaking. There's an issue right now with a federal judge ordering the EPA to take action on the Clean Water Act to help with the algae situation in Lake Erie. It seems like every day there's breaking news on the Great Lakes, and there's a new national interest. And I think that's what's so interesting about PBS and New York Times choosing your book. And I thought about it as I read through your book, that, there's such a new interest, and people, I think, who live outside the Great Lakes might even be more blown away by the things you brought up about the ways that man has messed with the Great Lakes. I think I take it for granted, but a lot of people outside the Great Lakes can't believe it. And that's some of the things that you point out so clearly in this book.
Well, thank you. And that was, I think, a product of the coming at this from a national perspective. And I did that because my agent was from New York City. The editor is from New York City. Both of them are Midwestern people who've spent their careers in New York. And I over and over, going through the drafting process of the book, they kept beating it into my head. You're not writing for the readers of the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. you're writing for somebody in, say, Virginia Beach or La Jolla. This is a national resource. It's a national story, and it needs to be told from a national perspective. And that's hard when, I was writing it often from an apartment overlooking Lake Michigan in the middle of Milwaukee, and it's hard to pull back and to realize that, say, the ballast water issue isn't just a daily incremental story. It's this huge tragedy, and it's a story. It's not an issue. And so, and many of the chapters in the book, I try to make them stories, not detailing very complicated issues, which is also what they are. So that was a challenge.
One of the first big, I would call it human manipulations of the Great Lakes, you start with in your book, is the St. Lawrence Seaway. And I think a lot of people had no idea that was unnatural. And of all the things that are unnatural, including the Chicago River, reversing a river. But let's start with the St. Lawrence Seaway. Just tell a little bit about, and when was that? Like, how early did man start messing with the Great Lakes?
Oh, right away. I mean, when at Montreal, there's Lachine Rapids, and you could paddle up or sail up from the Gulf of St. Lawrence, from the Atlantic Ocean, from anywhere in the world, up to Montreal. It's as flat as it looks on a map. I think Montreal is something like 18 feet above sea level. But right there, you hit your first set of rapids, and behind that is the rest of the once wild, natural St. Lawrence River, which was impassable to any kind of a boat. So canal and ditch digging began, hundreds of years ago, right as soon as whites arrived on the scene, and it was an incremental process to kind of chip away to get to Lake Ontario. And then once you got to Lake Ontario, of course, you'd have smooth sailing across Lake Ontario, and then you literally run into a wall called Niagara Falls. So they needed to build channels around Niagara Falls, and that was done in 1829. And the Erie Canal is basically the United States version of what I was just talking about. The canal around Niagara Falls is called the Welland Canal. That opened in 1829. In 1825, the Erie Canal, which links Lake Erie to Hudson River, to the Atlantic coast, opened in 1825. And that was a relatively small shipping channel. It was for barges. And the Canadians were much more ambitious. They wanted to bring in big boats. And so they kept expanding the Welland Canal and the canals along the St. Lawrence River throughout the 1800s and the 1900s. The final Welland Canal was opened sometime in the early 1930s. The problem was the canals and channels below that, along the St. Lawrence River, were not as big as the Welland Canal. So the boats in the upper lakes, Michigan, Huron, Superior, and Erie, were kind of like ships in a bottle. They couldn't get out. They could move a lot of goods between Great Lakes ports, but they couldn't get to the Atlantic coast. And so that's when the Seaway was conceived, and it was to build basically a super channel between Lake Ontario and Montreal, and it was to match the size of the existing Welland Canal, and it opened in 1959. The problem was the Welland Canal, as I mentioned, opened in the 1930s. So when they matched the Seaway locks to the Welland locks, instead of expanding both, they basically locked the Seaway in the shipping world that it was pre-World War II. And while they can handle these locks, very big boats, almost 800 feet long and 80 feet wide, those are tiny by today's standards. Mm-hmm. And coincidentally and unfortunately for the Seaway, while it was being built in the mid-1950s, the first container vessel sailed. I think it was 1956. And a container vessel is, a boat that's carrying a container that can be transferred to a train or to a truck, so products can be moved seamlessly without loading and unloading them by hand. And that demanded bigger and bigger and bigger ships, to the point where today it can be argued that the Seaway is kind of analogous to a narrow gauge railroad. It just doesn't fit with the size of the modern shipping fleet. We still get a lot of traffic on it. It's still a very important shipping corridor, but it's primarily, and I'm talking about Great Lakes shipping in general, it's a critical, important, big business, but it's primarily ships moving from one Great Lakes port or North American port to another. Relatively very few overseas ships come in, simply because the channels can't handle the modern-sized vessels. So about 5%, ballpark, of the traffic on the Great Lakes actually comes from these overseas ships known affectionately as salties. And it's typically steel coming in and grain going out. But they're not bringing just that. There's other stuff that they've been bringing, and that's largely what the book's about. It's about the contaminated ballast water that has flooded into the Great Lakes since the opening of the Seaway.
Maybe you could list just some of the things that doing that, manipulating the rivers and waterways and watersheds, almost every single time man did something like that, it brought something bad along with it. And maybe you could talk about some of the worst offenders. Was Asian carp the worst? Is zebra mussels the worst? Can you talk about some of the worst ones?
Yeah, okay, well, I guess to talk about this, the first thing that people need to understand is in their natural state, the Great Lakes, vast as they are, they span some 94,000 square miles, which is roughly the size of the United Kingdom. Big as they are, they were isolated from the rest of the aquatic world. And on the eastern seaboard, that was by the St. Lawrence River, as I talked about earlier, and Niagara Falls. And on the western side of the Great Lakes, it was the subcontinental divide that separated, it's basically a continental divide, it separated the waters of the Mississippi River Basin, which spans 40% of the continental U.S., from the waters of the Great Lakes. In some places, it's almost an imperceptible hump in the landscape, but it was a wall to any kind of species migration. And we in the book, I refer to these as the front door and the back door. And we opened up the front door with the early canals, culminating with the Seaway, and we opened up the back door with the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, when we basically rechanneled the river so it didn't flow into Lake Michigan, but it flowed out of Lake Michigan, punched through this subcontinental divide, and linked up with the Mississippi River Basin. So these doors were opened. Not long after came all sorts of species that wouldn't have otherwise made their way into the lakes. And things really started going south in the 1940s with the arrival of the sea lamprey, which came up in some ways, you want to say, honestly. They weren't brought in by a ship. They swam up the canals on their own. And these lampreys are East Coast natives, and they're parasites. They look like eels, but they're actually fish. And they make their living sucking the blood out of big predator fish. In the Great Lakes, they just found heaven, these aquatic vampires, and they took out the lake trout in a very short period of time. And the lake trout were kind of the wolf in the system. They were the apex predator, and when you lose that, everything below it is going to go haywire. And so all these little fish started to explode because there were no big fish to eat them. And unfortunately for the Great Lakes, not far behind the lampreys were the alewives, which also came from the East Coast, and they also swam their way in, and they're a little herring. They're typically a saltwater fish, but they don't need to spend their adult lives in saltwater if they find suitable freshwater habitat, which is what they found, like the lampreys. And so they got into the Great Lakes, and they just exploded. And by the mid-1960s, biologists were estimating that 90% of the biomass, the fish biomass in Lake Michigan alone, was alewife. So 9 out of every 10 pounds of fish was alewife. And they were great at breeding and reproducing and outcompeting native species, but they were also dying by the billions because they were constantly under stress, because they are a true saltwater species. So they were very successful at establishing a population, but it was also a very fragile population. And when you get big temperature changes in the lakes, you get these die-offs by the billions that I'm sure many of your viewers will remember, the dark days of the 1960s when you couldn't go swimming at the beach. You wouldn't even want to be within a couple of blocks of the beach. So that was really the first episode of bad stuff happening in terms of invasive species. It's when the idea that invasive species is a form of pollution started to take hold, a biological pollution. And this is kind of where the story starts, and then things get really interesting when we need to fix the lake. We've got these alewives are just ruining, the fishery. They're ruining property owners' ability to enjoy, their backyards. Nobody's going to the beach, so we needed to get rid of the alewives. And to do that, the first thing we needed to do was get control of the lampreys. And so there was a real can-do attitude at the time. This was post-World War II, and so some of the best fisheries biologists in the world assembled up on the tip of the Lower Peninsula and found a lamprey-specific poison that's used today. It's called lampricide. And it turned out that while the lampreys were in the lakes by the millions, we didn't have to poison the open waters of the lakes. We just had to find out where they spawned and then poison those streams. And so a lot of very, very hard, serious research went into this, and it took many years, the better part of a decade in the end, to find, what the chink was in the lamprey's life cycle and how to exploit that. And so by the 1960s, we were dosing these tributaries with this lampricide. It is a very specific poison because lampreys are a very ancient creature and they have a very crude liver, which made them uniquely vulnerable. So you can put this poison into a stream and basically kill nothing but little lampreys. Mm-hmm. So we got control of the lampreys. Then the question is, what are we going to do about the alewives? Because we've got to bring back a top predator. And a lot of people would argue that the natural option would have been to restore lake trout, remnant populations of which were hanging on in Lake Superior and in other lakes in North America that could have been used and were by the federal government used in a captive breeding program to try to reestablish that species in the lakes. But at the same time, the state of Michigan had its own idea. It wanted to bring in a sexier predator fish. So here we have an Atlantic invader in the middle of the continent in these alewives, and we bring in a Pacific predator in the coho and the Chinook salmon to eat the alewives and to create what is today a multi-billion-dollar fishery, but a wobbly one, because that's the first, wave of invasions. The lampreys, alewives, solved by the salmon. The second wave is a lot trickier because the first wave had to do with the top of the food chain. This second wave was caused by the opening of the Seaway, which brought in all these ships, and these ships weren't just coming in with what was listed on their cargo manifests, they were coming in with this contaminated ballast water. And that's how we've gotten 59, 60, it might even be 61 now non-native species since the opening of the Seaway in 1961. And the most devastating one so far has been the zebra and quagga mussels, closely related mollusks that basically took out the bottom of the food chain. The plankton levels in Huron and Michigan have been so stripped that the waters of those two lakes, which were once a brothy green, are now Caribbean clearer than Lake Superior, in fact. Some of the clearest water in fresh water in the world, and that's not the sign of a healthy lake. That's the sign of a lake having the life sucked out of it.
And can you explain, what are people doing about the quagga mussels, the zebra mussels right now? Have people just thrown up their hands and given up? And what is your estimation about what is going to happen because of the quagga mussels and zebra mussels?
Well, I don't think you can't predict what's going to happen. And that's why I think the most important thing is the Great Lakes are now, I can't remember the number, maybe 188 non-native species. I mean, for a while we were finding a new one every 6 to 8 months. And to the shipping industry's credit, over a decade ago, they began flushing those ballast tanks with salt water to expel any freshwater hitchhiker or to kill it with a salinity blast. And since then, the rate of discoveries of new species in the lakes has just dropped off dramatically. But they're still finding new species. They just in the last 2 years announced that they had found two new foreign species. How invasive they'll be, how troublesome they'll be, nobody knows yet. But we got these mussels. We got them the first one was found in 1986. And what I like to try to convey to people is that you got to look at this as like a superorganism, almost like a cancer. One little mussel isn't going to do much trouble, but when you get into the quadrillions, or the hundreds of trillions, each one can filter a liter of water a day. And when I say filter, I mean strip the plankton from. And so they're just kind of, a great vacuum on the bottom of the lakes. And there is no solution on the horizon to this. What is interesting is the zebra mussels were the first to come in, and they were followed closely by their cousins, the quagga mussel. And nobody thought that we'd ever get rid of zebra mussels in the 1990s, but the quagga mussels did that. They basically eliminated zebra mussels by outcompeting them, but they're also 10 times worse because they're covering 10 times the habitat just because they're a hardier creature. So we've got these. Who knows what's going to happen? I mean, something could come in, a virus or something that may naturally knock them down, but I wouldn't bet on that happening anytime soon. So it's just an impact on the lakes that we're going to have to live with. But interestingly, these invasions, they just keep happening, and behind the mussels came this little, like thumb-sized fish called the round goby, which came from the same place, the Caspian Sea basin, came the same way up the Seaway in a ballast tank of an ocean-going ship, and they're evolutionarily built to eat mussels. Now, we'll never have enough gobies to get rid of the ungodly amount of mussels that we have smothering the bottom of the lake. I mean, just a little aside here. In some places on Lake Michigan, they've been counted at 100,000 per square meter.
Per square meter?
Yeah,
100,000 per square meter.
Yes, and so you think about that. How can that be? If they're fingernail size, how could you fit 100,000 on a square meter? Well, it's not one dimensional. They stack on top of each other like coral. So, you know, it's this gnarly stuff. If you were to drain Lake Michigan, once you get beyond the nearshore area where the waves keep the mussels from taking a permanent foothold, if you get out about a half a mile or even maybe a little less, you could walk on a bed of quagga mussels from Milwaukee, 80 miles over to Muskegon. It's just dramatic. The mussels have taken out the bottom of the food chain because they eat the plankton, and that energy is locked up in these shells. But the gobies can eat the mussels. So anything that can eat a goby is doing all right. Unfortunately, the salmon don't. The salmon won't deign to go to the bottom of the lake and bang their snouts up, you know, grubbing out a living on gobies. But native lake trout are, native whitefish are, native walleye are. And so this is happening to a great degree on Lake Huron. It's been devastating for recreational salmon fishery, and you got to feel for the charter boat operators and these towns along the coast that, you know, were once thriving recreational fishing towns. They still are, but they don't have salmon anymore. But they do have lake trout, and they do have whitefish, and walleye are going great guns over there in Saginaw Bay. So it's kind of like the top of the food chain is stitching itself back together. The bottom may look more like the Caspian Sea, but the top is looking like the old Great Lakes more than any time it has probably in the last 50, 60 years.
So I was going to say, are you in this book, a wonderful book, you lay out some villains to the Great Lakes, and you lay out a lot of amazing scientists who did wonderful things to bring the Great Lakes back, and it sounds like you're saying you have hope for the Great Lakes now. It is on the way back.
You know, nature finds a way to balance itself, typically. And the problem is the lakes have been so rocked by this onslaught of invasive species that there was no really opportunity for this balance to emerge. And now that we've really slowed the rate of invasions, and the shipping industry is, you know, under EPA orders following a lawsuit, they're in the process of installing ballast treatment systems on their boats. And, you know, that should further ratchet down the possibility for new invasions. We'll never completely shut the door, but I think we can go a long way to shutting it further. And then let nature kind of sort things out, as is apparently happening on Lake Huron and beginning to happen on Michigan. So, yeah, I am optimistic. I just think that we need to look at the lakes with a fresh set of eyes and look at them for, you know, the ecological and economic trove that they are. I mean, navigation is critical, and nobody wants to see the boats go away. But I think we also need to manage the lakes with an eye toward more sustainability. They're not just nautical highways. You know, they define this region culturally, geographically, and for a lot of people, emotionally. You know, it's the Great Lakes. Once you live along them for long enough, they grab a hold of you in a way that I would argue other bodies of water can't.
I agree. Thank you so much, Dan Egan, author of The Death and Life of the Great Lakes. Thanks so much for talking with us.
Thanks for having me.